Have you ever wondered why a man becomes most restless, most exposed, when the woman he once took for granted suddenly pulls her presence away? It is in that silence, in that withdrawal, that his carefully constructed persona cracks, and what seeps through is not the polished mask he shows the world, but the raw, unpolished shadow he has long kept hidden. Carl Jung taught that every man carries within him a shadow, the repressed, unacknowledged aspects of his psyche that he denies, suppresses, or fears. And often, it is only when she detaches, when she steps out of the gravitational pull of his ego, that his shadow rises like smoke from a fire he can no longer control. In the beginning, he may wear a mask of indifference pretending her absence is inconsequential. He may distract himself with noise, with conquest, with bravado. But the unconscious is merciless. The more he resists the pain of her detachment, the more fiercely his shadow manifests. Jealousy, insecurity, rage, despair. She may not see it directly, but the signs appear in subtle gestures. The tightening jaw, the restless searching of his eyes, the compulsive reaching for validation elsewhere. These are not simply emotions. They are archetypal eruptions, primal forces emerging from the depths of his psyche. For the woman who steps back, there is both danger and liberation. She witnesses a man unmasked, no longer polished by societal approval, but trembling under the weight of his disowned self. And this revelation is not about him alone. It is about what happens when a woman detaches from the illusions she once nurtured. By withdrawing her energy, she forces him to confront the very parts of himself he wished to keep buried. She becomes the mirror he cannot escape, a living catalyst for his encounter with the shadow. Have you noticed how the detachment of a woman unsettles a man more than her anger ever could? Anger engages him, it feeds his ego, confirms that he still holds space in her emotional world. But silence, distance, indifference, these are unbearable to him because they force him inward. And inward is where the shadow waits. You may have seen this in your own life. The sudden messages, the unexpected appearances, the desperate attempts to reclaim what he once dismissed. This is not love. It is the shadow grasping at what once soothed his ego. Yet the true power lies not in his unraveling, but in her awakening. For when she detaches, she too faces her own shadow. Why did she tolerate his neglect? Why did she ignore the whisper of her own intuition? Her detachment is not merely an act against him, but a turning inward, a reclamation of self. Jung knew that individuation, the process of becoming whole, demands confrontation with both light and shadow. And when she steps back, she begins this work. She sees not only his hidden wounds, but her own. The need for validation, the fear of abandonment, the hunger for approval. Detachment is the crucible in which she burns away the illusions that chained her. Consider the words of Marcus Aurelius. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. A woman who detaches embodies this Stoic truth. She no longer surrenders her peace to the unpredictable tides of a man's moods. She reclaims sovereignty over her own psyche. And as she steadies herself, she becomes untouchable, not because she is cold, but because she is whole. This is what unnerves him most. When she is no longer moved by his promises, his charm, his anger, his absence, when she is free, his shadow screams louder. It reveals his dependency, his fragility, his inability to define himself without the reflection of her gaze. He may lash out or he may crumble. He may try to punish her or he may try to win her back. But in truth, what has been revealed is not about her at all. It is his shadow, laid bare by her refusal to play the role he unconsciously demanded of her. And you, listening now, have you ever wondered what illusions you have kept alive simply because you feared detachment? How often have you stayed, tolerated, appeased, because confronting the truth seemed more terrifying than enduring the lie? Detachment is not abandonment. It is not cruelty. It is the sacred act of turning away from illusion and turning toward truth. It is the doorway through which you step into your own power. What his shadow reveals when she detaches is not just his unfinished work, but her opportunity for liberation. For it is in this space, between his unraveling and her awakening, that the alchemy of transformation begins. When the veil of her presence is lifted, the man who once relied upon her emotional orbit stands face to face with the emptiness within. This is not the void she created, but the one he carried all along, the hollow space covered by ambition, bravado, or the performance of masculinity. A woman's detachment simply strips away the distractions, and suddenly he is left with himself, unadorned and unshielded. Jung would call this the confrontation with the shadow, the moment when the unconscious rises to demand recognition. Few men can bear this moment with grace, for it is not his carefully crafted identity that speaks now, but his deepest fears and wounds. His shadow whispers of inadequacy, reminding him of the father he failed to impress, the competition he could never quite surpass, the fear of being ordinary in a world that worships dominance. When she detaches, those whispers grow into a roar. Every silence from her feels like rejection. Every absence feels like abandonment. It is not that she is cruel. It is that her refusal to play the old role forces him into the chamber of his own suffering. He is confronted with what he tried to silence by clinging to her. For the woman, this revelation is both unsettling and illuminating. She begins to see the difference between the man's mask and his truth. The charm he wore so effortlessly was perhaps not confidence but a shield against fragility. His anger may not be strength but a frantic defense against shame. And now, as his shadow is revealed, she sees what was always there beneath the surface. Detachment, then, is not merely separation. It is illumination. It exposes both the man's hidden wounds and her own hidden patterns. How often have women mistaken a man's pursuit as proof of love, when in truth it was his shadow clinging to the comfort of being mirrored? How often have women confused intensity with devotion, when in fact it was insecurity disguised as passion? When she detaches, she begins to discern. She no longer looks with the eyes of longing, but with the eyes of clarity. And clarity, though painful, is liberation. You may feel the pull to return when his shadow rises. The desperate texts, the sudden tenderness, the promises of change. It is tempting to soothe him, to heal him, to step back into the role of savior. But ask yourself, are you healing him, or are you protecting yourself from the discomfort of his unraveling? Detachment is the art of enduring his storm without becoming its shelter. It is allowing him to face the truth of himself while you face the truth of your worth. The Stoics understood this well. Epictetus warned that attachment to what is beyond our control enslaves the soul. A man's shadow is not yours to heal, just as your worth is not his to define. To detach is to step into the wisdom of this boundary, to refuse the role of emotional caretaker, and instead embrace the role of sovereign being. And sovereignty is not coldness, it is freedom. When she detaches, something extraordinary begins to unfold. His shadow is revealed, yes, but her own light begins to expand. She realizes she was never powerless, never dependent, except in the illusions she herself accepted. Every tear she once shed for his neglect becomes a seed of awakening. Every silence she now chooses becomes an affirmation of self-worth. She is no longer entangled in the endless dance of proving her value. She is the axis upon which her world turns. And this shift is archetypal, not personal. Across centuries and cultures, stories have been told of the woman who withdraws, who reclaims, who rises from the ashes of dependency into the fire of her own power. She is Psyche completing her trials, Persephone ascending from the underworld, Inanna descending into darkness only to return crowned in wisdom. Her detachment is initiation, and what it reveals in him is secondary to what it ignites in her. You may notice this in yourself. The moment you stop chasing, stop justifying, stop waiting for crumbs of affection, you feel lighter. At first, the emptiness aches because you mistake it for loss, but soon you realize it is not loss, it is space. Space for clarity, for strength, for rebirth. In this space, his shadow is no longer your prison. It is his burden to bear, and you are free to rise. This is why detachment is not merely a strategy, but a sacred act. It is the tearing away of illusion, the refusal to serve another's unconscious at the expense of your soul. It is the moment you step into the fullness of your feminine power, not as a weapon, but as a truth. And truth, once embraced, cannot be taken from you. There comes a moment when the man, sensing her absence not just physically but psychically, begins to unravel in earnest. The mask that once held him together fractures, and fragments of his shadow leak into the world around him. He becomes restless, unpredictable, and at times even desperate. What terrifies him most is not her distance, but the realization that he no longer controls how he is perceived in her eyes. Without her validation, without her energy sustaining the image he wishes to uphold, he feels himself collapsing inward. And in that collapse, the truth is laid bare. He has never mastered himself. The shadow is not evil in itself. Jung made this clear. It is simply the unlived life, the ignored emotion, the unacknowledged need. Yet when ignored, it festers and corrupts. For many men, the shadow reveals itself in obsession, in rage disguised as passion, in jealousy that borders on madness. When she detaches, it is as though a dam breaks, and everything he suppressed comes rushing forth. He may try to win her back with intensity, or he may attempt to wound her with cruelty. Either way, it is not his authentic self speaking, but his shadow demanding attention. And yet, this revelation is not only about him. For the woman, witnessing the shadow teaches her something profound. It was never her duty to carry him, to rescue him from himself, or to absorb his chaos as though it were her own. How often have women mistaken endurance for love, believing that if they can withstand a man's storms, he will someday find calm? But detachment reveals the futility of this hope. His shadow is his work, not hers. The more she tries to hold it, the more it consumes her. By stepping back, she liberates herself from a burden she was never meant to carry. Have you noticed that when a woman no longer bends herself to soothe or accommodate, the man is forced to reveal who he truly is? Without the cushion of her constant forgiveness, his essence emerges, unfiltered. Some men, confronted by this mirror, begin the painful but necessary work of integration. They face the dark, admit their wounds, and slowly learn to own what they once projected. Others collapse further into denial, clinging to masks with increasing desperation. Her detachment does not create his shadow. It simply brings it into the light. 0. This truth can feel brutal. You may wonder, why must she witness his unraveling? Why must she endure the storm of his darkness at all? The answer is not punishment, but initiation. Through this confrontation, she is tested. Will she surrender her boundaries once more to pacify his shadow? Or will she stand firm in her sovereignty? Will she believe the pleas and promises spun in desperation? Or will she see them as echoes of his inner turmoil? Detachment is not only his exposure, it is her initiation into discernment. The Stoics spoke of this kind of strength. Seneca wrote, "He who is brave is free." A woman who stands her ground in detachment embodies this courage. She does not rage, she does not plead, she does not collapse into the theater of his shadow. She simply steps back into herself, and in that stepping back, she becomes untouchable. The freedom she gains is not from him but from her own illusions, the illusions that once bound her to his chaos. For her, detachment is not cold abandonment but sacred preservation. It is the recognition that love without respect corrodes, that presence without reciprocity depletes. When she detaches, she sends a message to her own unconscious. I am no longer willing to betray myself for the comfort of another. And this message reverberates through every corner of her psyche, strengthening her spirit. His shadow may rage at this. He may accuse her of cruelty, of indifference, of betrayal. But beneath those accusations lies a deeper truth. Her detachment forces him to see himself without the mask she once helped him uphold. This is the essence of projection, collapse. When the woman no longer reflects the image he wants to believe in, the man must confront the fractured self beneath. And you, listening now, may feel a resonance in your own story. Perhaps you too have played the role of the mirror, reflecting back to a man an image of strength he had not yet earned. Perhaps you too have carried his silence, his anger, his insecurity, as though it were your own burden to solve. But what happens when you detach, When you step out of the role he unconsciously demanded, his shadow emerges, but more importantly, your freedom begins. Detachment is not simply walking away. It is walking back to yourself. It is the reclamation of your time, your energy, your essence. In detachment, you no longer orbit around his wounds. You become the center of your own universe. And once you taste this freedom, you begin to understand. His shadow is his prison, but you were never meant to live inside it. The woman who detaches soon discovers a paradox. By stepping back, she not only reveals his shadow, but also shines a fierce light on her own unhealed places. For every man's unraveling reflects something she once tolerated, excused, or silently endured. His shadow, exposed, becomes the mirror for her hidden wounds. Why did she stay in cycles that diminished her? Why did she confuse crumbs of affection with love? Why did she ignore the quiet voice within that whispered she was worthy of more? In this revelation, detachment is not an end, but a threshold into her own individuation. Individuation, Jung taught, is the process of becoming whole, of uniting light and shadow within oneself. For the woman, this means no longer abandoning her intuition for the illusion of security. She learns that what drew her to him was not only his charm but the resonance of his wounds with hers. His inability to face himself mirrored her own reluctance to face her deepest need, to choose herself without apology. This is the crucible of her transformation. To detach is not to harden the heart, but to open it inward, to love herself with the tenderness she once squandered on someone unable to reciprocate. There, she finds the parts of herself she once disowned, the voice that demanded respect, the boundaries she silenced, the rage she swallowed. And in welcoming these, she becomes whole. Have you ever noticed that the moment you reclaim your worth, those who fed on your weakness grow unsettled? A man confronted by her detachment often scrambles to reassert control. He may suddenly offer the very words she longed to hear, or promises of transformation that echo with desperation. Yet if she listens carefully, she will hear not truth but fear, the fear of losing the mirror she once held for him. This is where her power crystallizes. No longer compelled to soothe or to chase, she stands firm in the sovereignty of her being. She recognizes that his healing is his alone, that her love cannot substitute for his inner work, that his shadow cannot be redeemed through her sacrifice. She steps back not in cruelty but in clarity, and in that clarity, she is no longer the girl who waits. She is the woman who chooses. The philosophers understood this awakening. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." When she detaches, she learns to master her thoughts rather than be mastered by longing. She shifts her inner dialogue from "why wasn't I enough" to "why did I settle for less?" The very question transforms her reality. She ceases to define herself through his acceptance and begins to sculpt herself through her own reflection. And this is what terrifies him most. It is not her absence alone, but the realization that she is no longer waiting. She no longer bends to his moods, no longer seeks his approval, no longer fills the silence with explanations. She becomes a mystery to him, because she is finally a mystery to herself, unfolding, expanding, discovering the depth of her own being. He is left staring into the void of his shadow, while she ascends into the fullness of her light. This dynamic is archetypal, woven into the myths that shaped human consciousness. In the ancient stories, the heroine does not remain in the underworld of another's chaos. She rises. She leaves behind the man who refuses to face himself, not out of malice, but out of necessity. Like Persephone returning from Hades or Psyche reclaiming her divinity, she emerges reborn, wiser, stronger, untethered. His shadow may rage in the darkness, but her light no longer bows to it. And you, listening now, feel the stirrings of this truth within yourself. Perhaps you are standing at that threshold, caught between the comfort of the known and the promise of liberation. Perhaps you are afraid of the emptiness detachment brings, but know this: that emptiness is not the absence of love, it is the soil from which self-love grows. In detachment, you are not abandoning love, You are finally inviting it to take root within you. This is the revelation. What his shadow reveals when she detaches is not only his unfinished work, but her rebirth. In his unraveling, she finds her strength. In his dependency, she discovers her freedom. And as she steps into this truth, she embodies the archetype of the sovereign woman, no longer defined by his reflection, but radiant in her own. There is a quiet majesty in the woman who no longer seeks to be chosen, but who instead chooses herself. When she detaches, she ceases to orbit the gravity of his moods, his promises, his inconsistencies. She no longer dances to the rhythm of his avoidance, nor does she chase the illusion of who he might someday become. In that sacred silence, she begins to hear the voice of her own soul, a voice that was drowned out for years beneath the noise of compromise and longing. And in hearing it, she realizes her detachment was never a loss, but a return. The man, meanwhile, wrestles with the shadow he can no longer deny. His projections collapse without her presence to sustain them. The image of himself as strong, desired, and in control disintegrates when she no longer affirms it. He is left with the raw truth. The boy within him still cries for validation, still fears abandonment, still resents vulnerability. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Yet few men are prepared for this confrontation. Many rage, many despair, and some attempt to pull her back into their orbit to avoid facing themselves. But the woman who is detached sees through the cycle. She understands now that his pleas, his sudden affection, or his accusations are not reflections of her worth, but eruptions of his shadow. She no longer interprets his chaos as a sign of love. She interprets it as a symptom of his unhealed wounds. And by doing so, she breaks the spell. His shadow is no longer her responsibility, and she ceases to be the container for his unconscious. This is where her power blossoms most fully. She begins to redirect the energy she once spent managing him into nurturing herself. The very devotion she poured into his growth becomes the devotion she pours into her own becoming. She invests in her body, her mind, her spirit. She cultivates friendships that feed her instead of drain her, dreams that expand her instead of diminish her. She becomes the heroine of her own myth, no longer the side character in his unfinished story. Have you ever felt that shift? The moment when your worth no longer hinges on someone else's recognition, when your peace is no longer disturbed by their silence? That is the moment of liberation. At first it feels strange, even lonely, because the old patterns no longer bind you. But soon it feels like breathing after years underwater. You realize you do not need him to complete you, nor do you need his chaos to feel alive. You are alive by your own essence, radiant without his reflection. The Stoics would call this the highest freedom, detachment from what you cannot control. You cannot control his shadow, his choices, or his willingness to face himself, but you can control your own alignment with truth. And truth whispers that you are whole already. Truth reminds you that love is not proven by how much you endure, but by how deeply you honor yourself. This transformation is not merely personal, it is archetypal. Across time, women have risen by detaching from the illusions that enslaved them. The alchemical process is always the same: death of the old self, confrontation with the shadow, and rebirth into sovereignty. What dies is not love, but illusion. What is born is not bitterness, but clarity. And clarity is the ground upon which authentic love may someday grow. The man, if he is willing, may also transform. Her detachment may force him into the very work he has long avoided. Some men, touched by the shock of her absence, finally begin the slow path of integration. They face their wounds, they own their insecurities, they begin the labor of becoming whole. Others resist, clinging ever tighter to denial, forever chasing women to soothe what only self-awareness can heal. But his path is his own. She no longer waits for him to choose it. And you, yes, you listening now, feel the truth stirring within. Perhaps you have given too much of yourself to someone unwilling to meet you. Perhaps you have mistaken chaos for passion, or patience for virtue, when in truth it was only avoidance. Detachment is your initiation into power. It is the refusal to live as a reflection of another's shadow, and the decision to live as the embodiment of your own light. What his shadow reveals when she detaches is more than his hidden fragility. It is her hidden strength, and once awakened, that strength cannot be silenced. She rises, not against him, but for herself. She no longer begs for love. She no longer trades her peace for attention. She no longer hides her power to preserve his comfort. She rises sovereign, whole, untouchable. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase. She chooses. End.